to be the very best, want it all.
I'd like to welcome everybody tonight to our show, session number 5, Understanding Students with Disabilities, an introductory survey course in special education for paraprofessionals. Our show tonight is going to address the characteristics of children and youth with behavior disorders, and I'm very excited to have the opportunity to welcome some very, very special guests. To my left, Dr. Thomas McIntyre. He's a professor of special education at Hunter College in New York City. Tom is also the president of the Teacher Educators of Children with Behavior Disorders and immediate past president of the New York Council for Children with Behavior Disorders. Dr. McIntyre is the author of several books and articles in the field of behavior disorders. To my right, Dr. McIntyre, I'd like to start with you. The field of behavior disorders has been surrounded by controversy, including not only the label, but the definition as well. Can you fill us in on what's going on nationally and locally?
Well, locally, our students, when they go out to teach, will find that depending upon the state that they're teaching in, their students will be called by different labels. Each state has the prerogative of devising its own terminology to refer to these students. At the national level, however, since 1976, our students have been called seriously emotionally disturbed. This is from Public Law 94142, the Education of All Children with Handicaps Act, and since been changed to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And a number of points here that have caused some concern to those of us in the field. For example, the word serious in the title. No other label in special education has the qualifier serious. We don't hear seriously learning disabled, seriously mentally retarded. And many students who are in need of services will not be served. Additionally, the terminology emotionally disturbed makes us think that all students will have psychological reasons for why they behave as they do. Many students have biological reasons for showing behavior that's not acceptable in the schools, or they may be modeling what they've seen in the home or on the street corner. So there are many different reasons for why kids behave as they do. Some other difficulties we have with the present definition: an unexplained inability to achieve. This is oftentimes confused with the learning disabilities definition, and kids who may not fit under the learning disabilities definition may be placed in this category and labeled emotionally disturbed when they have learning problems. I think we can all agree with this: an inability to build and maintain satisfactory relationships with others. Certainly that is a problem area. However, there's an exclusionary clause that says that kids who are socially maladjusted may not be served. Now, who are the socially maladjusted kids? Those are our tough, streetwise kids. These are kids who are not going to succeed in society unless they receive some special services, but the law says they can't be served. The author of this definition, Eli Bower, says, I don't know where this came from. When we sent this definition forward to Congress, it didn't have that in there. Somebody penciled it in somewhere along the way. The other three areas here are different types of emotional disturbance. These types were identified in one single study 30 years ago, and recent research and diagnostic categories now are much different than these. These no longer apply. These are out-of-date types of or ways of categorizing kids. Also, this demands that we categorize a kid as being a certain type of emotional disturbance before we label him emotionally disturbed. It's like putting the cart before the horse. And we've got a lot of assessment going on too early in the process. So a group that refers to itself as the Mental Health and Special Education Coalition, a coalition of about 20 or 30 different groups have gotten together and they've devised a definition which they would like to see replace this present one. Let's take a look at that. They would prefer to call these students emotionally or behaviorally disordered. That we can't open up a kid's head, look inside and say, look at those emotions, they're really disturbed. But we can say that behavior causes us some concern. So let's call it behavior disorders, and if we think there's a psychological basis, fine. Okay? But those kids get their needs addressed. And we look at whether the student's behavior is age appropriate. I think that was probably done under the present definition. But now they say we must also look at a kid's background, their heritage, their culture. That different cultures have different blueprints for creating a model citizen. And a lot of kids learn behavior that's right at home, but they get to the schoolhouse door and we say, whoa, don't be bringing that African American, Asian American, Arab American, Hispanic American, Native American behavior in here. That doesn't belong in here. And a lot of kids are showing the behavior they've learned to be right and true in the home. When they get to school, we say, forget your background, forget your heritage, act a different way. That alienates a lot of kids. We need to address their educational needs. We look at their educational performance. In the present definition, we only are referring to academics. In the new definition, we would say if the student has any needs with regards to creating a better citizen for our society, then those needs ought to be met. And we're talking about personal and social skills, we're talking about career, professional development, all that falls under the educational domain. It needs to be more than just a temporary response to stressful events, not just a divorce or a death in the family. I don't mean to say just, but that it's a persistent and ongoing problem that the student is having. It must be seen in at least two settings, so it's not just a personality conflict between Mr. Smith and the student or Mrs. Smith and the student. And at least, yes, and at least one of the settings must be in school, because this is an educational definition, a definition for educators. Must be unresponsive to interventions in the regular education classroom. We must try to keep this student in the general education classroom. If that's not possible, then we'll consider special education. New York City's ahead of the field right now. They have this two-stage process where we try to keep kids in the regular classroom first. And it can coexist with other disabilities, perhaps something that Susan will refer to later, that it used to be, or it is now, that we must say, you are one type of disability or another. Many kids have many disabilities, and they need many different types of services. And just to be sure that certain types of kids are indeed included, there's a little footnote at the end. The kids who are schizophrenic or conduct disordered must be included. We expect some variation on this to come before Congress in the next month or two. School board associations and school district administrators tend to be against this definition because you label a kid special ed, you can't suspend them or expel them, and they're afraid of losing some of their clout.
Well, that really summed up many points that have been made by different groups across the country. Marilyn, now that we've heard a basic definition, can you give us some examples of behavior that kids exhibit?
Yes, certainly. First, let me say that children who are labeled behavior disordered often exhibit the same behaviors as, quote, normal children, but they engage in these behaviors with more intensity, with longer duration, and with a higher ratio of inappropriate behaviors to appropriate behaviors. So that's really what sets them apart and makes them much different from the children we consider normal. Basically, we're talking about two kinds of problems here. One is acting out, and what we see typically in the classroom are things like arguing with the teacher, arguing with the peers, refusing to do work, refusing to comply with instructions and directions, being the class clown, bullying other children, making physical or verbal threats, and not doing their schoolwork. So those would characterize most of the acting out kinds of behaviors we see in classes. At the other extreme, we have children who are very shy and withdrawn. And these children typically avoid making eye contact with others, particularly adults. They do not do their schoolwork quite often. They will not talk in front of the class. They have few social interactions with their peers or adults, and they don't make friends easily. So the two extremes, I think most teachers are familiar with kids like these in their classes who may or may not become labeled emotionally disturbed or behavior disordered. One other thing that I've noticed over the years is that quite often the children, whether they are acting out or shy, either one, often have difficulty in reading, and sometimes particularly the acting out behavior covers up academic problems, especially reading problems. If you're disrupting the classroom, you don't get called on to read as much. And I think that's probably true for many children who exhibit problems in the classroom.
All good examples. Now, Mrs. Young, you've heard from two professionals. What you're hearing, are these the same behaviors you observe in the home?
Yes.
Can you share with us, is there any differences?
Well, the difference is, I would like to say, with the children that doesn't make friends easy, my child is different. they want to make friends with other children, but sometimes it's hard for them to let the children know they want to be their friends, and then if they find that they're easy to shy away, they take advantage of it. So the child gets afraid and they back off. And in school, it's just the reverse. They become the class clown or the child that be picked on no matter what, or the child unheard. If the child wants to do something and 3 other kids are doing it and they want to join in, the other 3 says no, they don't have...
So I'm glad that you mentioned the impact of the environment. Tom, the CCBD organization of the Council for Exceptional Children, the students have heard a lot about that this semester, frequently addresses the issue of assessment. Now, listening to what Susan has said and looking at the multiple different avenues that you could look into to try to get to causation, what are some of the, well, let's start with the pre-referral phase. What were some of the strategies or techniques that are being used now? You had mentioned the New York City Board of Education moving towards including children in general ed before looking at the other special ed option.
Right, and New York City is different from many other districts. What goes on in a particular school, or what goes on in the schools varies from school to school, district to district. Typically, a general education teacher becomes concerned about a student's behavior, fills out a referral form, and submits it to the head of a panel. What happens then, what the panel does at that point, can go in many different directions. Some panels get together, they listen to the teacher and some other folks who know this kid. They say, okay, what should we do? And they devise a plan that they feel is best for that student. Other districts require more documentation. They might ask people to fill out forms, answer certain questions. They might, if they're influenced by behaviorism, have somebody go into the classroom and do behavioral recording to determine the percentage of time the student is out of the seat, or the number of times the student says a rude or offensive remark. And then you compare those numbers with the typical student in a general education classroom and determine is it different than the typical student. Many times teachers will be asked to fill out a checklist or a behavioral checklist where there are many different misbehaviors or aberrant behaviors delineated, and you go down the list and check them off or rate them from on a 1 to 4 scale or 1 to 5 scale. I have some concerns about that because oftentimes behaviors that are listed as aberrant are not in certain cultures, does not give eye contact when being disciplined. Well, many African American, Asian American, Hispanic American homes require that their students look down when being disciplined. In my culture, the European American culture, look at me when I'm talking to you. Right? So the student is doing what they feel is right, but we say misbehavior. Or it may be that many low-income and working-class African-American students show they're interested in what's going on by getting enthusiastic, participating, moving. And we want the kids to sit still, raise their hand to be recognized. We force them to learn in a style which is not theirs. I think I'm getting into instructional strategies now, but as for assessment, it does vary depending upon the district and the school.
And what about the other part of it? What happens if the pre-referral phase leads us to believe, because of the data that we collect, that a more structured type of evaluation system has to take place? The students heard about the special ed process, the makeup of the school-based support team, the roles and responsibilities. What other types of formal instruments or evaluation methods are used to try to determine, as I'm sure Blake went through, what was the best setting for him to receive educational services?
Sure. I want to point out that the checklists are also used later on for evaluation as well, and some of them have normative systems so that they do have some validity. But one of the things I would argue about is that there's no box attached with an NA, not applicable designation. So teachers are almost forced to rate a behavior which may not even be an issue in the arena for that child.
That's a good point.
So that's a concern. One of the first things we have to do by definition is rule out that there is no mental retardation that's confounding the problem. And so an IQ test is indicated. And the one that really nets out the most information that's very useful to us is the WISC-3R. And the test is designed using a subtest format, and there are several subtests in the verbal area and several subtests in the performance area. and we also get a full-scale IQ. But what the test is able to show us is patterns of strengths and weaknesses. So while it's serving one issue, it also generates enough information so that instructionally we learn a great deal about how this student ought to be served. There are other formal kinds of things. From a medical point of view, we might want to have an EEG done just to see if, in fact, there's some clinical evidence of brain damage. We may want to do blood work to see if there are elevated lead levels for certain children. And I think that's going to be a continued issue now with concerns about lead exposure. We also tend to give an educational assessment, some formal battery, and a test like the Woodcock-Johnson educational battery is quite comprehensive. And all the time we're trying to make comparisons between current level of performance and a child's current grade placement and whether or not they're close together or far apart. Checklists, the kind that Tom McIntyre was talking about, look at clusters of behavior that might be occurring in the classroom, which can be done. There's one by Brown and Hamill that looks at having the child rate himself, having peers rate the child, having the parent do a rating, having the teacher doing a rating. It's a real ecological instrument that kind of brings together lots of viewpoints about how the child is behaving cross settings. So I think that has, you know, a lot of important information to offer. A child would also be seen by a psychologist for an interview, and someone who's a really trained interviewer can glean quite a bit of information, looking for behavioral excesses, behavioral deficits, and how the child presents, self-esteem issues, when a child makes lots of negative self-referent kinds of statements about him or herself. And also, there are projective devices which are also normed, like a Rorschach or a thematic apperception test, which can yield some information about recurrent themes or patterns or issues of concern for a child. But I have to come back to something that was said earlier about one of the best ways to know how children are functioning is to really do in vivo observation right out there in the classroom, and to look at work completion, work accuracy, on-test time, appropriate social, inappropriate social, the kinds of interactions kids have amongst themselves.
And that kind of leads into what Marilyn's going to talk about, the movement now towards curriculum-based measurement. There's been a tremendous amount of training going on within the New York City Board of Ed, especially with their ed evaluators or other members of the team, school psychologists, and looking at what role does curriculum-based measurement play. Marilyn, could you fill us in on some of the observational methods that are being encouraged in this area?
Well, essentially the bottom line for schools, of course, is that we're there to try to make changes in the child's behavior, to try to decrease the inappropriate behaviors and increase appropriate behaviors, whether they're social or academic. So in doing this, it's important to deal with concrete, observable behaviors rather than labels. And rather than say, Johnny is the most disturbed child I've ever seen, or he has a mental problem or he wouldn't do that, which doesn't communicate anything very valuable. It's better to talk about what the child does. What does he actually do? What are the behaviors? For example, if the child ignores the teacher's instructions or directions, talks when others are talking, doesn't complete assignments, and these are all typical behaviors in the classroom, you're more likely to be successful at changing those behaviors because they're observable and measurable. And I think that's an important thing that everybody needs to understand. Calling the child behavior disordered, as I said, doesn't communicate clearly. What's behavior disordered to one teacher or in one setting is not behavior disordered in another, as we've heard previously. Another thing I think that comes into play, and that is that teachers have not been trained to separate motivational problems from learning problems. And again, when you begin to talk about specific observable, measurable behaviors, then you can begin to find out what's happening immediately preceding the inappropriate behavior and immediately following. And once you can identify those components, then you can begin to identify ways of changing the behaviors. In curriculum-based assessment, and I think Tom mentioned this, you would observe the child in the classroom, direct observation in the classroom over a period of several days or even several weeks in some cases. and record the frequency or duration of the inappropriate behaviors in question. Psychological testing in this sense becomes a little less important because we're dealing with what's going on in that classroom. The concern is what the student does that causes the teacher to think that the child might have a behavior disorder. Then you would also observe other children in the classroom who have, quote, normal levels of that same behavior to find out what the norm is for that particular classroom, and then compare the child to those local norms, so to speak. Again, it's a matter of the degree to which a child differs from his or her peers that really signals whether or not there's a severe problem. Teacher perception is definitely important and certainly needs to be taken into consideration. If the child is demanding all of the teacher's time, taking away time from the other children and so forth, then it is a problem. Now, whether the child is behavior disordered or not is a separate issue in that case, but it's something that needs to be addressed. But curriculum-based measurement, I think, is probably one of the best things that has come along in many years. In addition to looking at the child's behavior problems in the classroom, someone also needs to do some very close monitoring of their academic performance, looking at specific things like, is the problem or begins it but doesn't finish it, doesn't try to do the work. And until the child is trying to do the work, you can't find out what the problem is if he's not succeeding academically. So the first thing is to answer that question of whether it's a motivational problem or a learning problem. If it's a motivational problem, then it's simply a matter of reinforcing the child for doing the work. If you reinforce the child for trying, and the child is trying and is turning in his work, and yet it's still incorrect, then you can suspect that there might be a learning problem, and then you probe further to find out what that learning problem is. You do error analysis of curriculum areas, reading, math, spelling, and so forth, and then you begin to really pinpoint problems that you can deal with on an academic level and then also on a social level because you've done those kinds of observations too.
Dorothy, what role does the parent play in all this? We've talked about the role of the teacher and the role of the different members of the school-based support team and the role of the curriculum. What about the parent? What role do they play? How can you offer
information? Well, the parent, I think, is the first one who should recognize these conditions in their children. I mean, as a parent, I did, and I took the proper steps by having an evaluation done. Then I had to go to the school support team and fight to get my child in special ed due to the fact there was a series of incidents that happened to him between the age of 4.5 to 6 that really brought the condition out, which I have to go back and say, even when he was a baby, he had it, but I didn't know it. He used to have very piercing screams at night for 2 years, from the time he was 6 weeks old until he was 2 years old. He was on phenobarbital 3 times a day, or a quarter teaspoon. And at that time, I made tape recordings of these, what we thought was nightmares. Now I know was not nightmares. This was part of the problem, even as a baby. But what made me notice it was when I punished my son, I said, sit in the floor. He said it didn't bother him. He didn't have to have any books, no paper, no pencil, not humming, not doing anything. It did not bother him. If I was going to give him a spanking, he would get a belt, and he says, here, go ahead and hit me. I'm not going to cry. It doesn't bother me. That's when I made my mind that something is definitely wrong.
Where did you start? I mean, once you knew that something was wrong, what was the first contact with the...
With my child's pediatrician. I went to the pediatrician. At first, she didn't want to believe it, but then I insisted that these are the things he's doing, and then he backed it up because he admitted, yes, I do these things. I mean, he was playing with fire. That was another thing. I think that's when they really decide she must know what she's talking about, because he was smart. He poured water on the floor, and I always keep a little water pail in the house. He took the water pail, set it inside the circle of water, put the paper in, and lit it up. And when I smelled smoke, and I said, wait a minute, I smell smoke. He said, no, you don't. I said, I do smell smoke. He says, oh, that's just in the circle of the bucket. So I go in his room, and sure enough, in the floor, he put the water. He said, but with the fire prevention, you're supposed to wet the area around where you're going to put the fire. So, I mean, in my son's case, he had a lot of intelligence as well as doing something he shouldn't have been doing. He knew to keep the floor from catching on fire, he should wet the floor down.
And many of our kids, that is the case. I mean, that they might be exhibiting behavioral challenges to us in a classroom, but also cognitively, very good problem-solving skills, analysis skills, and they really have figured out or done a thorough analysis of their environment, of what they can get away with, what they can't get away with. I think that leads us into something I was going to ask Marilyn, and that is the importance of ongoing monitoring, because we just heard a case of a mother who recorded these supposed nightmares from 6 weeks to 2 years. I mean, so what about ongoing monitoring and really looking for sometimes small victories?
Right. Well, first of all, I want to say I think that's wonderful that you're doing that kind of thing. I hope you keep.
In your case, because in my case, when this CSE went to do the evaluation, my son was on medication.
Oh.
So there's a different program. If the child medication has taken on, the child will not display those conditions because the medication is working and they really want to work, and even though you may be there, it wouldn't bother them. And I found out what I did to them, I said, now you did the evaluation with him on medicine without letting me know. Now I want you to do the evaluation with no medication. That's when it says, we can't believe it. We can't.
Right.
I said, no, because when he leaves me, he's on his medication. By the time you get him,
to keep going. The child is getting reinforced, for example, by his peers. He's the class clown. They laugh at what he says and does, and he gets away with it because, I mean, that's a pretty powerful reinforcer. And a teacher might not always see everything that's going on because the teacher's busy teaching.